I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and I'm very glad to welcome all of you tonight, even as we continue to navigate this very difficult and challenging period. As always, I want to thank the friends of the Jewish Community Library who make everything we do at the library possible, particularly now that the library is independent. I do hope you'll consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. And tonight's program is made possible in part by longtime friend Larry Bergheimer, and we greatly appreciate that. Please note that automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We'll all be muted except for our presenter, but people will have the opportunity to ask questions after the presentation, which I do hope you'll do. Please put your questions in the chat, and then I will relay them to Professor Grinberg. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Marat Grinberg. He's a professor of Russian and humanities at Reed College. He received his BAs in comparative literature from Columbia University and in modern Jewish studies from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And his PhD is in comparative literature from the University of Chicago. He's a specialist in 20th century Russian literature and culture with an emphasis on Soviet poetry, modern Jewish literature, culture, and politics, and post-war European and American cinema. He's the author of I Am to be Read Not from Left to Right, but in Jewish, From Right to Left, The Poetics of Boris Slutsky, and a book on Alexander Askoldov's great film Kommissar. And he's also the co-editor of Woody on Rye, Jewishness in the Films and Plays of Woody Allen. And he'll be speaking tonight about his newest book, The Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, which was just published earlier this year by Brandeis University Press, and is a great book. Okay, and Marat, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Howard. Wonderful to be here. I'm glad we're in the same time zone because sometimes these talks take place, in Europe, and I have to get up at 6 a.m. So this is actually very nice and great to see such a nice audience. So I think I'll talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions and hopefully we'll have a great discussion. So I'll be talking today about my, as Howard said, my most recent book called The Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, Jewish Culture and Identity Between the Lines. And I think the materials that I explore in the book, examine them in the book, are quite relevant for the moment that we're living in, the difficult, traumatic moment in Jewish history that we're living in. And I think you'll see that, hopefully see that relevance. Okay, so let me just plunge in. Let's see if okay. Does everybody see yeah, okay, great. So I want to begin, before we kind of get into the content of the book, I want to begin with talking a little bit more generally about Soviet Jews, Soviet Jewish identity, and especially how it's has been perceived in the United States, and I think continues to be perceived to a large extent. And sort of thinking about the mythology around Soviet Jewish identity. And so these three images that you see in front of you on this screen, I think they provide a good window onto that mythology, and and those images will be familiar to you. So starting with this first one on the left, which is a poster dating from the time of the project by the American Jews of forcing the Soviet Union to release the Soviet Jews, to allow them to immigrate. So here we have Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, Let My People Go in 3 languages, Отпусти народ мой in Russian, and as well as in Hebrew, Shlach et Ami, and very much kind of this presentation of Soviet Jewry as victims, as victims of persecution by the Soviet government, and this presentation of Soviet Jews as somebody that needs to be saved, right, and rejoin kind of the wider Jewish community. Definitely a very noble effort, and to some extent, maybe even to a large extent, it is true. And yet, as I will show, it is only a piece of what made Soviet Jewish identity, this idea of victimhood and persecution. So that's one piece. Now we go to the second image, That is, I bet it's familiar to all of you, and that's of course Fiddler on the Roof, Chaim Topol, who just passed away recently, and the idea of the old country, Fiddler on the Roof being a very loose adaptation of Sholem Aleichem's Tevye the Milkman cycle, and the idea of the old country, and I think in the mind of American Jews, and kind of, again, that's part of this mythology of Soviet Jewry, there's this connection that they see between Soviet Jews and that old world, the old country. So in a way, that Soviet Jews are still very much part of that idea of the shtetl, that we see in Fiddler on the Roof. And then the third image, and that's a cover of a very influential book by Elie Wiesel, The Jews of Silence, that comes out in the early 1960s. And Elie Wiesel, of course, I think the name is familiar to you, right? A Holocaust survivor, a great writer who kind of puts the Holocaust memory on the map in the West, in the United States. And so he travels to the Soviet Union in the early 1960s, goes to Moscow. I think he also goes to Leningrad, where he meets with various Soviet Jews, and says that Soviet Jews, because of this constant persecution, he calls them the Jews of silence, right? They're unable to express, not even so much, according to him, express their Jewishness, but really to practice Judaism. So he very much kind of depicts them as yearning for piety and wanting again to rejoin the traditional Jewish world. And then he turns it around by the end of the book, and he says, well, actually, there's another group that is also Jews of silence, and he says, American Jews, you're the Jews of silence, because in fact you're doing nothing to help your Jewish brethren from this Soviet empire to leave. And so we have kind of the jump from this image to the first image, and this call by Elie Wiesel to American Jews leads to the establishment of this attempt project by American Jews to force the Soviet government to allow their Jews to emigrate. So these three pieces, right? Persecution, victimhood, the old country, and this idea of the Jews of silence, I think these are kind of three crucial components of the portrait of the Soviet Jew that has formed in the United States, in the West, and in some extent also, I think, in Israel. And it's interesting when we look at these waves of Soviet Jewish immigration to the United States or to Israel, there was definitely kind of that discrepancy between this mythology that American Jews had of their Soviet Jewish brethren and the reality, right? The reality, the actual Soviet Jews that they encountered didn't quite fit, or didn't really fit into this portrait. So what I have tried to do, what I attempted to do in my book, is to re-examine this mythology, and instead to argue that the world, the intellectual, cultural world of Soviet Jews after World War II, after the Holocaust, after Stalin's death, was certainly under persecution, was certainly fragmentary, but at the same time, it was rich, it was complex. And what I'm doing through my study is giving the Soviet Jews, the generations of Soviet Jews, in a sense, back their agency, as we like to say, sort of in the academic jargon, right? To present them not just as victims of the Soviet regime, or as, these poor Jews who needed to be saved by the outside world, but actually as people who were trying to fashion their own identity, right? And who very much wanted to make sense of what it means to be a Jew. And so my book examines the various ways through which they were able to accomplish that, primarily thinking about the books that they read, the books that they collected, and how they read those books. This idea of what I call the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, the Soviet Jewish library, I think is a really useful window onto opening up that very rich world of Soviet Jews after World War II. Okay, so now let's see. Moving on, a little bit more about the questions that I'm asking in my book. So here you see a picture of me I think probably at the age of 12, maybe 13, maybe 11. I honestly don't remember. And what do you, in this pensive look, and what do you have? What do you see behind me? You have a bookcase filled with books, some of which were, classics of Russian literature, translations of American literature, European literature, but also definitely the books that I will be talking about, which were very specific to these Soviet Jewish bookcases. But in general, a bookcase was a centerpiece of a Soviet apartment, at least the Soviet apartments where members of the intelligentsia resided, your engineers, your teachers, your doctors, yeah, but also many others, right? Books in the Soviet environment were nothing was readily available. Yeah, books were like a pair of jeans that you really needed to have, or I don't know, that particular perfume that you really needed to have, obtained through the connections you had, or the black market. Books were things that one hunted for. Yeah, and again, for Jews, there were specific books that they were looking for, and we'll talk a little bit about why. Yeah. So the questions that I'm asking is, what does Jewishness mean in Soviet context? Yeah, and I started to talk about that already. Of course, primarily keeping in mind that within the American context, within the Western context, to be a Jew is to belong to a religious denomination. Yeah. Whereas, of course, throughout the millennia of Jewish history, this is not how Jews thought about themselves. Jews, since if you go back to the Hebrew Bible, Jews have always thought about themselves as first and foremost a people. Yeah, what we call Am Israel, the people of Israel. Of course, the people that are also governed by the laws that they receive from God and have a special relationship with God, but a people, an ethnic community bound by these blood ties, right? And so that sense of Jewishness as an ethnic identity was absolutely how Soviet Jews thought of themselves, a great majority of whom were not observant, yeah, not just because of the persecution and the fact that Judaism, just like all other religions, was under enormous pressure in the Soviet Union, but also, again, if you grow up in an atheist state and you need to obtain education, you need to survive, you need to advance in your career, it is inevitable that you're not going to be religious, that you're not going to be observant. Doesn't mean there was not an interest in Judaism as a religion, yeah, and we'll come back to that. But this is also where kind of that, I think, arrow by Wiesel comes through, where again he talks about Soviet Jews yearning for piety and wanting to really become observant. I think he really misses kind of what was at the core of Soviet Jewish identity. Another question I'm asking is how to recreate the realities of Soviet Jewish culture, right? So how I conceived of the book is very much as an kind of this archaeological, anthropological, cultural excavation, right? Essentially looking at the bookcase as something that has all these layers that one needs to dig through, as one would do at an excavation site. And again, I think looking at these books and how they were read really allows us to recreate that reality in all of its complexity, which always was, and I always mentioned, was fragmentary. Right? We cannot speak about some kind of wholesome sense of culture. No, it was these various fragments that Soviet Jews needed to put together to make sense of who they were, yeah, and to obtain some Jewish knowledge, yeah. Also thinking again, this kind of Soviet component, not just because of persecution, anti-Semitism by the state, but because they did reside within this country, and they were products of Soviet education and participated fully within the Soviet life, while often having very skeptical views, of course, about the country that they were living in. I talked about kind of the Jews of silence, and then the way that I'm trying to return the Soviet Jews the language that they spoke, and say that they were not, in fact, Jews of silence, and looking at these various contexts, yeah, cultural, literary, historical, and just if you look at this bookcase where you have side by side, again, the Russian classics from Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Turgenev, to the translations of American literature, Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, they were so beloved by Soviet readers in general, to, again, these specific installments that one would find in these Soviet Jewish bookcases, of which I will speak. And those juxtapositions and intersections of contexts, I think, are really fascinating and interesting. And why is this important today? Well, I think it is very important because it is impossible to understand the Jewish experience in the 20th century, or even the Jewish experience in modernity, without taking the Soviet Jewish experience into account, right? Soviet Jews constituted the largest Jewish community in the world in the 20th century, after the United States and the State of Israel. Also, of course, because despite the fact that the Soviet Union is not alive anymore, so many Soviet Jews have ended up in these various other places in the world, the United States, Israel, Germany, and are playing active role in the communities in those countries. In particular, think about Israel, where, of course, every fourth person you see on the street in Israel comes from the former Soviet Union, and the enormous role that Soviet Jewish immigrants played in the Israeli society, Israeli culture, and Israeli political life. If you think about some of the politicians like Natan Sharansky and Avigdor Lieberman, right? So kind of to understand where they are coming from, I think it is important to go back to that bookcase and to think again what shaped their worldview, what shaped their identity. And not just Israel. Of course, we've been thinking a lot about Russia's war against Ukraine, yes, and of course the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who happens to be very much a Soviet Jew, a Soviet Ukrainian Jew, he's just a year younger than me. So we come from very, very similar backgrounds. I also come from Soviet Ukraine, and I bet 99 point whatever percent that some of the books, if not all the books that I'll be mentioning today, were also and probably still are in Zelensky's parents' bookcase. Yeah, Zelensky, of course, is a politician who makes the choices that he makes for a variety of reasons. So I don't know if he drew the lessons from those books that I'll be talking about today, but it is significant. It is significant to appreciate that. And I also think, because of the moment that we're living in, and just before we started today's talk, Howard and I were talking about the situation on the US campuses that are just filled with anti-Israel, anti-Jewish hate, including my own campus. I think the lessons that one can draw from how Soviet Jews dealt with anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism that was thrown at them are very useful today for American Jews who are starting to deal with something similar, right? So the lessons of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, I think, are very relevant and important today. Yeah. So this is my Soviet Jewish bookshelf. As I was writing the book over a period of years, I was putting it back together. Some of the books that we brought when we came, my family brought when we came to the United States in 1993. Some of the books that I obtained, throughout these years in the secondhand bookstores in Israel, in Moscow, in Germany, in Bulgaria, in other places. Yeah, and kind of putting it back together. And again, we'll talk a little bit about some of the installments of this bookshelf. Before we get into it, let me I don't want to do a history lesson, but just 2 minutes or so, just to give us a very quick overview of Soviet Jewish history, right? And why that moment after World War II is so significant. Yeah. So when we get into the beginnings of the Soviet state, the Soviet regime, 1920s, the prevalent ideology is internationalism, right? The internationalism of all these ethnic groups that comprise this new Soviet state. And the Soviet state very much encourages at that point the development of various ethnic cultures and literatures in their languages. Jews are not an exception. Yeah. If you look at the 1920s, there's a flourishing of Yiddish. Right? The Soviets always disdained Hebrew, which they saw as related to religion, which they saw as related to Zionism. But Yiddish very much was seen as a Jewish, as the language of the Jewish folk. Yeah, and the idea was in the 1920s, yes, let them develop and and have their literature in Yiddish and theater in Yiddish and all of these things, and let's indoctrinate that this enormous Jewish population that was concentrated in what was called the Pale of Settlement, right? These parts of current Ukraine, Belarus, that where the Tsarist government allowed Jews to reside. And of course, throughout the majority of the Russian imperial history, Jews were not favored at all and were in a pretty bad shape. So in the 1920s, the idea, let's indoctrinate them in their own language, that is in Yiddish. And so up until 1926 or so, in the former Pale of Settlement, you have Soviet Yiddish schools where kids going to those schools are learning the same thing that the kids are learning in Ukrainian and Russian schools and Belarusian schools, but they're learning it in Yiddish. They're learning it in Yiddish. Yeah. As we get into the 1930s, and of course Stalin becomes the tyrant that he was, we have a new generation of Soviet Jews being born and raised who are very much starting to acculturate into this wider culture, wider ideology, and beginning to speak Russian as their first language, or in some cases speaking Ukrainian as their first language, and Belarusian. But again, still throughout the 1930s, there is very much this development and existence of Soviet Yiddish culture, represented by very notable writers and theater directors and filmmakers, etc. As we get closer to World War II, and of course the Holocaust, we already start to see the beginnings of state anti-Semitism. Yeah, imposed by Stalin and imposed by his regime. And if you read the memoirs of those Jews who fought in the Red Army during the war, my own grandfather, for instance, yeah, at the front, fighting the Nazis, this was the time when they first encountered real anti-Semitism. Yeah, at the front, where you had all these different nationalities coming together, and the Jews started to see that they're in fact not liked at all. We get through World War II, the Holocaust, yes, and just keeping in mind that at least half of the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust, half of them came from the Soviet territories, yeah, and also the Soviet territories that the Soviet Union acquired at the beginning of the war, Western Ukraine, and the Baltic states, yeah. As we get toward the end of the war, the state anti-Semitism really begins to develop and flourish. Yeah. First of all, the Soviet Union develops a policy that they're not going to emphasize the specific fate of Jews during the war. And there is this kind of euphemistic language that was developed that peaceful Soviet citizens were killed, very, very rarely emphasizing that they were Jews who were killed because they were Jews. Yeah. And you have two major anti-Semitic campaigns right after the war. First, in 1948, the so-called anti-cosmopolitan campaign, where essentially the Soviet regime says that Jews have double loyalty. They're not really loyal to the Soviet regime. They're hiding behind all these names that they take. And this affects everybody, right? Jews working everywhere. Again, your engineers, your teachers, etc. Affects everybody. Affects students at universities. Yeah, you can think about my own grandfather, who is a law student at the Kyiv State University after the war. And then another major anti-Semitic campaign right on the eve of Stalin's death, the so-called doctor's plot, when all the major medical doctors are accused of being spies and wanting to poison the party elite. Yeah, and then most historians agree that the ultimate step in this anti-Semitic plan that Stalin had was to take Jews from the European part of the USSR, those Jews who came back after the war, yeah, those Jews who have survived, to take them and ship them to the camps in the north, yeah, labor camps. And we can, of course, imagine that had that happened, what the result would have been, that, great majority of them probably would have died or starved to death, etc., etc. That does not happen because Stalin dies, and he dies on Purim, which some see sort of as a divine intervention. Yeah. And so as we get into this period after Stalin's death, that's the situation that Soviet Jews find themselves in. A great majority of them, again, speak Russian as their first language. They're very much acculturated into this country that they live in, but they also, of course, recognize that they are different. Right. And the question that I'm trying to answer is how they interpreted that difference. what meanings they imbued that difference with. And finally, one crucial kind of historical point is that after Stalin's death, as Nikita Khrushchev comes into power, he initiates a number of these liberal reforms that have come to be known as the thaw, ottepel in Soviet history. When when I teach this stuff, I always tell my students, when the window is just slightly open and there's a breath of fresh air that comes in, that leads to this enormous cultural renaissance in literature, in theater, in cinema, the development of ties between the Soviet Union and the West. So the kind of the canon, what I call the canon of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, is really formed during this thaw period, during this period of liberal reforms. And even later, when those liberal reforms are kind of shut down, and we get to Brezhnev, and the regime again becomes much more authoritarian, it's very hard to completely close that window, right? And so the air has changed under Khrushchev during the thaw, and the Soviet Union never did go back to that absolute kind of totalitarianism that there was under Stalin. So that's kind of the historical background. So let me, for the next 15 minutes or so, let's talk about the contents again of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. So I get this idea of the Jewish bookshelf. It is a very prominent image in modern Russian literature, modern Jewish literature. And one very prominent example of that comes from Osip Mandelstam, the name that is familiar certainly to some of you, great Russian poet, great Russian Jewish poet, killed by Stalin, dies in the camps at the end of the 1930s. So in his autobiography, The Noise of Time, which comes out in the 1920s, Mandelstam talks about the bookcase in his parents' household. And he sees that, he describes this bookcase as a geological bed. And this is where I get this idea of kind of looking at the bookcases as a geological bed that needs to be excavated. And Mandelstam talks about that the books one finds in your parents' bookcase, they form you for the rest of your life. And then he talks about these different layers, the Jewish books, sacred Jewish books on the bottom, dusty and kind of untouched, and then the centerpiece, the Russian classics, the German classics. And this is also how I, not that I compare myself to Mandelstam, but this is also how I structure my book, and looking at these different layers, and why certain books would be front and center for everybody to see, and why certain books would be hidden deep within that bookcase. We can also think about great Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik, who also has this beautiful poem where he's describing returning to his hometown and returning to the bookcase and speaking to the sacred Jewish books with which he no longer kind of has that common bond. And then another crucial idea that I have in the book, and that's the idea of writing and reading between the lines. And I take this idea from Leo Strauss, this fascinating political thinker, political scientist who leaves Germany in the 1930s and comes to the United States and becomes a professor at the University of Chicago, where he teaches for the rest of his life. So Strauss develops this idea that says that in totalitarian regimes, the thinkers, the writers, need to protect themselves from these outside powers that want to destroy them. And so they develop this special way of writing, which he calls writing between the lines. And what that means is that the text has two layers. There's a layer on top, which he calls exoteric, which is accessible to all. Anybody can understand it, anybody can read it. And then there is a deeper layer, which he calls esoteric, which is a hidden layer, hidden knowledge that only a few can access because they kind of have this special relationship with the text. So writing between the lines leads to reading between the lines, right? And he says this is how intellectuals operate within these totalitarian societies. And I think that's very pertinent for the Soviet, not just the Soviet Jewish experience, but the Soviet experience in general, but for the Soviet Jewish experience especially, because as we'll see, there were some books that were explicitly Jewish, and one that did not really need to read between the lines to get whatever one wanted to get out of them. But in many, many cases, one needed to do that. Because the majority of the books that I'm examining, these are books that were published officially. Because what's so interesting about the Soviet Jewish case and about how the Soviet regime approached Jewishness is not, I think, persecution, it's not anti-Semitism, but that in the Soviet Union, in the periods that I'm discussing, there was really no public space for expressing Jewishness, right? Just the very word Jew, Yevrei, was kind of this anathema. If it was said out loud on very rare occasions, it would either invoke laughter or some hateful comment, or just an absolute shock that the word was even uttered, right? So these Soviet Jews who, as I said, did know that they were different and wanted to understand what that difference meant, did not have a public space to express it in any shape or form. And so one of the very few ways that they could do that was to do it in the privacy of their apartments, again, through the books that they had on their bookshelves. And very interestingly, that those books were published officially, which tells us something about how Soviet censorship worked and why certain books were published and why certain books were not published. And hopefully I can tell you a little bit, and maybe during the Q&A, we can touch more on that. So what did that bookshelf, standard Soviet bookshelf, considering, of course, the differences, regional difference, generational differences, right? And in fact, again, because there was no official Soviet Jewish community, yeah, just like in the United States, there was no, Jewish community centers or anything like that. Yeah. So to put together that history, one always needs to keep in mind that it is imperfect, but nevertheless, I think commonalities were there. Yeah. And so what do we find there? Translations from Yiddish, translations from Hebrew in some cases, translations from German that were very, very important. There were books that were read universally by so many, and the books that were not read. What I mean by that is that they were there on the bookcase for symbolic reasons, and that primarily, I think, applied to to translations of Soviet Yiddish literature. There were books that were marginal. Yes, there were books that were canonical that, again, you would find in so many families, books that were more or less widely accessible, and the books that were much less so, that one could get only if one lived in the capitals, Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, yeah, or the Baltic states, Riga, for instance, right, the capital of Latvia, but not those like my family who lived in provincial Ukraine. There were books, of course, that were meant for adults and for children. Children's literature was very, very important. There were books that were thematically Jewish, kind of explicitly Jewish, and then the books where that Jewish content was hidden and kind of needed to be gotten out through reading between the lines. There were books that were absolutely cult, for instance, some of the science fiction works that I'm writing about. And of course, a huge part of the Soviet bookshelf were the books that dealt with the Holocaust. Yeah. So as I said, kind of the official memory of the Holocaust really did not exist in the Soviet Union. Some very, very few instances. Overall, it was obfuscated, it was erased. Nevertheless, the Soviet Jews absolutely had a deep memory about the Holocaust, what took place of the Holocaust, and carried it out through various ways. And one of the major ways that that memory functioned was through the books that they read. And there were a number of books, prose, poetry, documentary works that were published during this thaw period, officially published, that did touch on the Holocaust quite explicitly. Yeah. And formed kind of a very important part of this bookshelf. And then I'm interested again in the various components of this memory and the reading strategies. In other words, how they were read. Let me skip this. So let me talk a little bit about this. And this is what I call kind of Soviet Jewish scripture. Yeah, Soviet Jewish scripture. And these are the works of the German Jewish author, Leon Feuchtwanger, a name that perhaps is familiar to some of you. Yeah. So Leon Feuchtwanger was a major German Jewish author from the 1920s and on. He primarily wrote historical novels dealing with all sorts of historical periods, going back to antiquity, the medieval period, and also the modern period when Hitler comes to power. Feuchtwanger leaves Germany when Hitler comes to power, and then through France, ends up in the United States, where he lives for the rest of his life in Los Angeles in the Pacific Palisades, right next to Thomas Mann and Franz Werfel and all the other great German and German Jewish emigres. The translations of his novels were tremendously important for Soviet Jews already starting in the 1930s. Feuchtwanger was very much a man of the left. And in the 1930s, he is not really terribly kind of hopeful about Stalin and his regime, but he sees that between these two alternatives, Nazism and Stalinism, he's going with Stalinism, right? Seeing that as the only alternative really to Nazism. He visits Moscow in 1937 and has a long hour, fascinating conversation with Stalin that I describe in my book. And already during that period, he really begins to realize the importance that his book had for Soviet Jews. And that importance really starts to flourish in the 1950s and 1960s, where we have the publication of his collected works. And what was so important about those books is not just that they were filled with this positive historical Jewish content, but that also, if you go to the back of those volumes, you had appendices, you had commentary that explained in pretty objective terms everything or so much of what one would be reading about these books. Information about Judaism, Jewish history, Jewish literature. Yeah. So imagine you go through the entire 10 years of secondary school and then university education, and not once, unless you were studying, ancient Semitic languages, but really not once would the word Jew be even found on a page in your history book. It's as if they never existed. It's as if they never existed. And so where does one go to find out about Jewish history? One went to Feuchtwanger. And this is a personal example. When I was probably 12, 13 or so, my mom was a piano teacher, took out a volume of Feuchtwanger from that bookcase. You saw the picture at the beginning, gave it to me and said, you have to read it to understand what it means to be a Jew, right? So to read Feuchtwanger was a rite of passage, right? It was experiential reading that really shaped, molded, and nourished your identity as a Jew. Unfortunately, Feuchtwanger, who was pretty big when he was alive in the United States, has primarily, pretty much been forgotten, and most of the translations of his novels into English are out of print, and that should be fixed and corrected. He is a very interesting writer, even outside of all this context. This is when he's in Moscow. We can talk about that. Later. So this is what I call kind of the core of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. Here again, you see a Soviet Jewish apartment in the 60s or so with the bookcase right there. Salvage fragments. Yes, we can talk about the classics of Russian literature: Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Gogol. Some of those works are filled with pretty negative depictions of Jews and what that meant to Jewish readers. This, of course, Pushkin, the great Russian poet. He was not a Hasidic Jew. I just like this picture of Pushkin in a kind of Hasidic garb. Yeah. And this is the canon. This is in a sense the core that is shaped during the thaw. So just to mention some of these writers: Ilya Ehrenburg, fascinating writer, journalist, poet, who after the war, after Stalin's death, starts to write his memoirs, which he fills with all of these Jewish fragments, again, about Jewish history, pre-war Jewish life, the Holocaust, the post-war anti-Semitic campaigns, and those books become an absolute revelation for the Soviet Jewish reader. We can think about this writer, Vasily Grossman, who writes some of the major works that really compare for the first time Nazism and Stalinism. Yeah, of course, he cannot publish those works, but he does still publish a number of works that do touch on the Holocaust in some profound ways that are published in the 1960s. We can think about this writer, and he's probably familiar to quite a few of you, and that's Isaac Babel, writer who really comes into his own in the 1920s. He comes from Odessa, from southern Ukraine, and he's killed by Stalin also in the 1930s, and his books are republished during this thaw period, and he becomes an absolutely cult figure for not just for Soviet Jewish intelligentsia, for Soviet intelligentsia in general, but he has special importance for Soviet Jews. And in general, that place, that city Odessa, that has been in the news lately because of the war in Ukraine, was one of the few kind of places on the Soviet map that was recognized by so many as Jewish, and so many important writers came from that city. Here is another pair, Ilf and Petrov, yeah, because they are Odessan terrain, Isaac Babel. Let's skip that. We can think about children's literature, right? And I'll mention just one writer, a woman writer, Alexandra Brustein, who comes from Vilna, Lithuania, yeah, and who writes essentially kind of semi-autobiographical memoir about a girl growing up in Vilna before the revolution. And that book, to this day, in a sense, there are all these kind of this fascination with this book, but that book really became a cult classic, especially for so many girls. Yeah. And again, it was just filled with all of these fragments about pre-revolutionary Jewish life. And that was something that the Soviet regime was okay with, right? Let's have the descriptions of Jewish life before the Soviet times, when Jews were persecuted by the Tsarist regime. That was okay. But how do you read between the lines? Soviet Jewish readers could recognize themselves in these portraits, in these Jewish portraits before the revolution. Okay. Just briefly, the Holocaust corpus, as I said. So the translation of Anne Frank, the diary of Anne Frank, with the preface by Ilya Ehrenburg, comes out in 1961, and just such an enormous event for Soviet Jews, right? Again, thinking about these books, few books that really put the Holocaust on the map. Another book that must be translated, and that's a book, I Must Tell, by Masha Rolnikaite. Masha Rolnikaite was an inmate in the Vilna ghetto during the war, and she writes this memoir of her time there. First, she writes it in Yiddish, then it's translated into Lithuanian, and then finally comes out in Russian, also with Ehrenburg's help. It is a thoroughly Holocaust book. Yes, it was censored. Yes, she had to kind of throw some things out, but ultimately, it was absolutely thoroughly Holocaust book that was so treasured by the Soviet Jewish readers. A book by Anatoly Rybakov, Heavy Sand, the novel that comes out later, which was also, this was the book that my grandfather, he would take it from the shelf, give it to me and says, you have to read it to understand what it means to be a Soviet Jew. And as a 12-year-old, I just didn't quite understand what he meant. I fully understand what he meant now. It's actually beautifully translated into English and comes out in the United States in that period. We can also talk about poets. We can talk about the science fiction writers, the Strugatsky brothers. Yeah, interestingly, science fiction was that realm where Jewishness could be explored in some fascinating ways. And finally, again, we can talk about the translations from Yiddish. Few translations of Hebrew before the Soviet Union breaks diplomatic relations with the State of Israel after the Six-Day War. We do have cultural relations between the two countries, and the translations of Israeli literature in the early 60s, very interesting ones, which were, again, because of this enormous solidarity that Soviet Jews had with the State of Israel, were so important. And so I'll mention two final examples, and I'll take questions. The first is, again, this is a militant atheist state that says all religions are opium for the masses, churches, synagogues, mosques destroyed in the 1920s. Then sort of religion is, you can be religious, even practice religion according to Soviet constitution, but in reality, anybody who did was absolutely persecuted. And so there was a field of social sciences established in the Soviet Union, which was called scientific atheism, научный atheism, which meant that we need to study religion from this Marxist perspective. Yeah. And within this realm, there were books written about Judaism. And very interestingly, a number of the authors of these books were Jews themselves, who really did see what they were doing is writing between the lines. That is, on the one hand, they were producing these books that were called The Dusk of Judaic Religion and the reactionary nature of Judaism that said Judaism is horrible, just like all other religions. But at the same time, they were able to provide some information about the history of Judaism, information about the Holocaust, right? And between the lines, convey so much information to their readers that were kind of starving for this information. And we can come back to that. And now this is so relevant. This is so relevant, right? That is, again, after the Six-Day War, diplomatic relations are broken, and Israel becomes the arch enemy of the Soviet Union. And there is another science, social science, that is developed really in the halls of KGB, and that is anti-Zionism, right? The science that says that Zionism is the most reactionary ideology possible. Zionism is the new fascism, etc., etc. And you can see how what we're hearing and seeing today is just a replica. It's just a replica of that. Here is one such volume where you see the swastika and the Magen David enveloping the world. Here's a spider web, right, enveloping all these capitals. Now these books very, very rarely were written by Jews. They were actually thoroughly, absolutely anti-Semitic. But very interestingly, these books were bought by Soviet Jews. Sometimes they were bought by them because they would buy them and destroy them. But they also bought them to gain some information about Israel, where it was not about reading between the lines, but reading by crossing out the lines. And this really hateful and pernicious literature, they knew how to deal with it. And interestingly, I found so much of it in a wonderful secondhand bookstore at the old bus station in Tel Aviv, South Tel Aviv, right? I don't know if that bookstore is still there. And it's just filled with these books, which shows that the Jews who came to Israel actually took these books with them. And so it is very, very kind of interesting chapter within the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. And those books, of course, would be somewhere on the bottom, kind of stuck deep in there. It's another, just this horrible volume published in Ukrainian, Judaism bez prikrask and Judaism unadorned, another example of that. And I can tell you about my own personal experience. Yeah. And so I end with this with these two images. So on the left, so this was just recently when I was in Israel this past summer, and you see people throwing books out, kind of garbage bins. Yeah. And so here are these Soviet Russian books, and among them are, of course, the books that one would find on the bookshelf that I'm describing, right? So that's maybe the future of these books. And of course, on the right is the cover of my book that is trying to hopefully uncover the richness of this really Soviet Jewish civilization, imperfect, fragmentary, but a culture and civilization nevertheless it was. And so I do hope that the future of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf rests with this rather than this. So thank you. I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to take questions and answer your questions and comments. Yeah.
Thank you so much. The chat is open for people to ask whatever questions they have. Please do ask questions. I'll start with one with just a request. If you could talk a little more about the role that science fiction played specifically.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and this is very interesting to me now because I'm now working on a new book, which is really exploring this enormously rich layers within Soviet and East European science fiction, Polish also. So science fiction became that venue for exploring Jewishness, first of all, because so many of the major sci-fi authors were Jewish, but also by its very definition, science fiction is so much about allegory. And it is so much about kind of that coded language. And so it inevitably became a venue for exploring Jewishness in various ways. Two writers that I specifically discuss in this book are the Strugatsky brothers, Arkady and Boris, who were the sci-fi gurus from the 1960s and on, were absolutely worshipped by their readers, and Soviet Jewish readers had a special relationship with them. The Strugatskys, they had a Jewish father and a Russian mother, and so many, a great majority of their books have a Jewish component, either coded or more explicit, allegorical, dealing with anti-Semitism, or there are some Kabbalistic elements, Talmudic elements, biblical elements, kind of just ruminations on Jewish fate in the world. And so, what I'm discovering now is that there were so many others. So many others. Also keep it in mind that Soviet science fiction experienced a renaissance during this thaw period and was very much influenced by Stanislav Lem, great Polish sci-fi author who was also Jewish and a Holocaust survivor coming from Lvov, Lviv, Western Ukraine. And so yes, I very much see kind of Soviet science fiction as a Jewish realm, as a Jewish art form. In some really fascinating ways, and luckily, the novels of the Strugatsky brothers have just been retranslated into English, pretty much all of them, and are accessible. So I would urge you, they're great books in general, But the Jewishness there is so rich and so fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm curious as to whether you were able to get insights into the state publishing industry itself, and to whether Jews were involved in, any background into the decision making, and whether Jews were part of that and of that decision making.
Not at the top, right? So of course, again, the kind of the Soviet Jewish intelligentsia, yes, so many were involved in, in these various presses and magazines and journals and whatnot. Yeah, and kind of the Soviet censorship machine was multi-tiered, right? First, you had to go through all these stages, kind of sort of the criticism by your peers, until once you get to the final stage, the party censor, you had to go through all of these other steps. And Jews were, yes, they were there, not to mention that so many of the major writers, some of which I'm discussing, like the Strugatsky brothers or Yuri Trifonov, for instance, were Jewish or half Jewish. But in general, how these decisions were made, sometimes they were just made. There is really no rhyme and reason to why this book was published and that book was not published, right? So, for instance, if you think about Feuchtwanger, why, when, as I said, there is no public space for expressing Jewishness and there's this erasure, you have these novels that are just thoroughly and explicitly Jewish. Why? Because Feuchtwanger was German, because he was a leftist, kind of the Soviet ally. So publishing him was okay. Yeah. Or if you look again at some of these books that discuss pre-revolutionary Jewish life, again, that was okay to some extent because that was before the revolution. Or even talking about the Holocaust, let's say the Warsaw Ghetto, that's okay. We're not talking about the Soviet territories, collaborations in the local population and the Nazis, right? So a lot of these kind of decisions had those kind of political underpinnings. But also, if you get into the 1970s, it's hard to explain, like the publication of Rybakov's Heavy Sand, that's what comes out early 80s. It's hard to understand why precisely at that moment, that thoroughly Jewish book, which is also a pretty conventional Soviet kind of war novel, comes out. Yeah. And so kind of the Soviet censorship machine is tricky to figure out.
Great, thank you. So the question from Boris asking for your thoughts about Yuri Sloskin's book, The Jewish Century, and whether that influenced any of your ideas.
Interesting and difficult question. Yes and no. Yes. I mean, certainly, when that book comes out, and it does have an effect on kind of the field of Soviet Jewish studies, right? Because Sloskin very much talks about the acculturation of Soviet Jews into the Soviet society, and kind of that Russification that happens, from the 1920s and on. The problem with that book is the enormous generalizations that he makes, but also that he very much concentrates on the intelligentsia in the capitals, right? And he very much wants to say that there was this absolute Russification, acculturation, and there is not much of the Jewishness that actually remains, which is precisely what I'm arguing against in my book, right? To say that, yes, we need to take the Soviet component seriously, and the Russian and the Ukrainian, of course. But what is also interesting is that there was this very rich Jewish layers, right? Also, very, very unfortunately, I have to say, now Yuri Sloskin is a pretty, open supporter of Putin and his regime in his war in Ukraine. He has also just did a really disgusting, I should say, interview about Israel, where he calls Israel a racist state by definition, and etc. So it's unfortunate. Perhaps the roots of that are already in his book, but that's where we are.
Thanks. Judith Taylor asks, she knows that you talked about the translations, which were important. Were there translations from English? And if you could say which authors were tended to be translated.
Specifically translations from English that had to do with Jewish literature.
Not necessarily. She notes Faulkner, or yeah. I guess who would have been important to Jews, or found themselves on the Jewish bookshelf.
Right. So in that respect, as I said, especially American literature, translations of the American authors. Hemingway was absolutely worshipped by the thought generation, but also Fitzgerald, but also Faulkner, but also Steinbeck, but also, if you think about Sergei Dovlatov, who becomes this cult author, later on and immigrates to the United States, he said that reading these translations of American literature made him the writer that he was. So that this is the generation of Joseph Brodsky. American literature was for them really everything. Yeah. And of course, Soviet Jewish readers would be no exception. In terms of kind of the specific, if you think about American Jewish literature, your Philip Roth, your Saul Bellow, your Malamud, those were not translated into Russian. But interestingly, for instance, I.B. Zinger was also not translated, right? And we can think of Zinger really as an American Jewish, phenomenon later on. But for instance, Kornei Chukovsky, who was a major children's poet, critic, translator, writer, he was obsessed with I.B. Zinger. And if you go to his house in Peredelkino, just outside of Moscow, and see his beautiful bookcases, there is a photograph of I.B. Zinger there, and I discuss it in my book. And Chukovsky wanted to have I.B. Zinger translated into Russian, and one can only imagine what importance that would have had. Yeah, but that did not happen. So there, the regime just would not allow any of that.
Great, thanks. So if folks can put whatever questions, so this will be your last opportunities to put your questions in the chat. We have one from Olga Zilberberg asking, to what extent do you think the culture of reading between the lines was a general Soviet practice versus Soviet Jewish?
I agree. Yes. I think kind of that Aesopian language, right? And reading between the lines, of course, is a dominant practice in totalitarian societies, and certainly applies to the Soviet case in general. Again, I think with the Soviet Jewish readers, it takes on these specific characteristics, right? They enhance it. They deal with it in their own way, especially if we think about, again, some of these books that I mentioned that come from, scientific atheism, or if you think about a writer like Yuri Trifonov, who in a sense, was such an important writer for the intelligentsia at large in the 1970s and 80s, but for whom this Jewish theme was also so important and really between the lines. Yeah, he kind of perfected that method, sort of following in Chekhov's footsteps and talking about what is unsaid being more important than what is said. So I would see the Soviet Jewish reading between the lines as certainly a component within this larger phenomenon. Yeah, but very much having its own specificity, if not uniqueness.
Thanks. Okay, so we have the question, how do you explain that after immigration, the majority of Soviet Jews landed on the political right of Western societies?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I think, Soviet Jews who grew up in a totalitarian socialist country or authoritarian socialist country, and who were fed from childhood, the slogans about the brotherhood of nations and various discourses about minorities, that they now hear from the left in the West. They link that with what they've been fed in the Soviet Union, and this is how they see it. Or if we think about kind of this, anti-Zionist propaganda that is so prevalent in the West today. So I think because of that experience, and being very, very suspicious of everything that comes from the left, that leads to them drifting toward more conservative side of the spectrum, be it in the United States or in Israel, but also, of course, keeping in mind the big differences between conservatism in Israel and what conservatism means in the United States. Yeah. So I would see that as a reflection, again, of where they come from, their upbringing, their experiences, but also of what has happened to the left in the United States and the forms that it has taken on, which sometimes sound eerily reminiscent of what they encountered in the Soviet Union.
Thanks. So a question from Olga Zilberberg again. So asking, I'm curious what you think about Thomas Mann, whether he fits on the bookshelf. She notes that Joseph and His Brothers was a big thaw book, and that was corroborated by Sonia Melnikova-Reich, who notes that her first introduction to the Old Testament was in Joseph and His Brothers. And if you could maybe comment on Mann.
You're absolutely right, Olga, and I have a whole section about that in the book, and around the question of how would one access any knowledge about Scripture, right? Where just a Bible, I mean, be it kind of the Christian Bible, it was just not accessible. You just can't get it unless you had one stuck somewhere deep in the bookcase from your great grandparents, or because you had ties to some of the Baptist groups in the West that would smuggle Bibles into the Soviet Union. But by and large, you just can't. So how do you get that knowledge about biblical stories? So there were all these popularized retellings of the Bible by Zenon Kosidowski that I discussed in particular. He's a Polish writer who had presented a very, very positive, kind of portrait of the Hebrew Bible. And those were with print runs in millions and were just devoured by Soviet Jews, but also fiction. Yeah, a fiction, Feuchtwanger would be important here, but also Thomas Mann, of course, was not Jewish. Yeah, but Thomas Mann, who writes, this fascinating trilogy, Joseph and His Brothers, which is beautifully published in a beautiful translation by a translator who happened to be Jewish in the 1960s. And it really becomes part of the canon, at least for the most intellectual part of that intelligentsia, right? Reading Joseph and His Brothers is not easy. Not everybody could do that, but it becomes that, it holds that importance. Or for that matter, we can think about Mikhail Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, an absolutely canonical book for the thought generation and on, yeah, where half of the book takes place in Moscow and half of the book takes place in Jerusalem. And it is very much a Christological presentation because, of course, it is about Christ, but nevertheless, right? So Soviet Jews kind of had these competing versions of the Hebrew Bible, yeah? And rarely would they have the access to the actual biblical text. That happens later, yeah. Keeping in mind, we think about translations of Yiddish literature. Sholem Aleichem. You can't read Sholem Aleichem, you can't read Tevye the Milkman without the Hebrew Bible, because Tevye talks and quotes and misquotes of Hebrew Bible all the time. And of course, at the back of the collected, works of Sholem Aleichem, you would have also appendices that would say, this comes from there, this comes from there. The fact that the Soviet Jews really did not know their Bible that well also shows they didn't read Sholem Aleichem very carefully. But absolutely, Thomas Mann is crucial. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This was really great. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. Marat, do you want to leave us with anything?
I would just say, if you have more questions, comments, please send me an email. I'm happy to answer. And I hope you buy the book or get it from the library or whatever, and read it and spread the word. I've been having quite a few of these talks about the book, and I see that it does present an interest to a wider, not just academic audience, which is how I wrote the book. I tried to write it in a human language, not academic language. And so, again, I think the content is interesting, and the Soviet Jewish experience matters. And so, yeah, just, continue reading this stuff, and I wish you well. And there's not an easy moment that we're living in.
Agreed. Okay, well, thanks. And everybody, I wish you light at Hanukkah.
Yes, and Chag Sameach, happy Hanukkah. Yes.
And be well. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.